Villains, bad guys, baddies, foils, antagonists, anti-heroes. Today we're talking about villains, all the different things that make them up, how to make them better, how to make them for your world, and how to put them in a story that makes sense. Let's get started. A villain is always going to be the hero of their own story. Now let me explain what I mean by that. Villains exist because things have gone wrong, and probably gone wrong for them. Now, a villain and a hero have a whole lot in common, but as we go through these tips, it gives you an opportunity to really examine what it is that makes up a villain and how you can come up with one that makes sense for your universe, no matter what system you're playing. When you're thinking about classical villains that exist in lots of different genres, one easy one that I can point to right away would be Thanos from Infinity War and Endgame. Thanos as a character in those films is a pretty amazing villain because you understand his motivation. When he talks about what caused him to want to destroy half the universe, it wasn't out of destruction or bloodlust or anything like that. It was about a desire to bring balance. And the thing about it is that understanding why he wants that is what makes him sympathetic. And having a villain that's sympathetic is oftentimes a great way to create something that gives your players their own conflict when thinking about how to defeat this specific villain. If you have a villain with a goal that's relatable, it gets even better because your players might not look at them as a villain in the first place. So thinking about the next step, what makes a villain a villain? And more specifically, what separates a villain from just a regular bad guy or a baddie or a foil or a thug? What makes Emperor Palpatine so much more scary than his stormtroopers? What makes Kang and Shredder so much more terrifying than the Foot? All of those different villains have something in common. They're exceptional. And what makes them exceptional is incredibly different across all of those different stories. But it's important to remember that all of them have something about them that elevates them above the other bad guys around them. What makes them exceptional doesn't necessarily have to come from the same place. Some villains are exceptional because they're much more physically strong, much more physically able, they're faster, they're more powerful, they can take more punishment. Some of them are a lot more intellectually superior. They can see where the heroes are going. They can pick and choose exactly how to stay 1, 2, 5, 10 steps ahead of the heroes so that they're constantly keeping the party guessing on where they're going next. Think about Kevin Spacey's character in Seven. Talk about a creepy villain. He's so far ahead of the heroes in that story that you really can't predict what's going to happen next. You know the theme of what he wants to do. You just don't know how. Going a completely other direction from Seven, let's talk about Mean Girls for a second. You want to talk about a villain that doesn't necessarily rely on physical ability or mental ability, you're looking at Gretchen. She is so much more charismatic than all of the other people that she helps run, the plastics, that she doesn't necessarily even require any kind of other physical or mental attribute. She knows exactly what she wants, and she knows exactly how to twist the knife, exactly how to motivate people to do what she wants, because she is that much more socially capable, adept, and maniacal than all the other people that take place in that movie. Now I know it's a bit of a jump to go from Seven to Mean Girls, but at the same time you're dealing with the same type of idea. These are villains who are exceptional in their universe, and it moves them to be that much more powerful than just a regular bad guy in any of those universes. That's something as sort of a bonus tip to consider. Why does a bad guy work for a villain? Think about that. Why do stormtroopers work for the Empire? Well, maybe they get paid. Maybe they have respect. Maybe they have the ability to go wherever they want and meet new people and do interesting things. They're part of a military force. Why does the Foot work for Shredder? Go look at the first Ninja Turtles movie. It's basically the same motivation as any gang. You're looking at dejected youths that have been cast out by society, maybe unloved by their parents, and they've been thrown into a world that doesn't respect them until they don the Foot costume. Then everybody fears them because they're these crazy ninjas who eventually get defeated by a group of mutated teenage turtles that have been trained in ninjutsu. Either way, the point is, bad guys work for villains because they want something too. We've talked about a bunch of different things that make villains villains, such as maybe they're sympathetic, maybe they're exceptional at something. And that's oftentimes two very common characteristics of what make heroes heroes. But what separates a villain from a hero? It's very specific, a flaw. Villains are flawed. First time, every time, all the time. Doesn't matter where they come from, because villains, like I said, are usually the heroes of their own story. And if they're not the heroes of their own story, then you kind of get into this whole idea that can be a lot of fun sometimes of like a villain who's just evil for evil's sake. Think about Cobra from G.I. Joe. Think about Boris and Natasha from Rocky and Bullwinkle. Think about Shredder from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, although in some cases they actually did give him some backstory. Whatever. The point is, if you know what your villain's flaw is, then you can start to figure out a little bit more about them and a little bit about what made them break bad, as the term goes. Let's go back to thinking about Thanos. So Thanos, again, wants the idea of bringing balance to the universe, right? But how does he go about achieving it? He wants to kill half of all life. It's that overreaction that he has to the problem that he wants to fix that makes him flawed. Yes, he might be sympathetic. Yes, he's exceptional. And you might even understand, or in some cases agree with the fact that what he wants to do is necessary. But the fact is, he wants to murder half of all life. And any hero worth their salt is going to want to stand in the way of that. And that flaw is oftentimes what makes villains so stand out. Because without a flaw, what you're going to end up with, possibly, is a villain who is so sympathetic and so charismatic that the heroes might end up being like, well, I kind of agree with them. And then they might change sides. And don't get me wrong, if you as a storyteller have created a villain that is so compelling that your heroes end up switching sides to help the villain, congratulations, you've just pulled the wool over your entire party's eyes and I commend you. But if you know what your villain's flaw is, like Thanos' overreaction, or Palpatine again, the idea of what does he want? He wants peace to reign over the entire galaxy, but in order to have that type of peace, he needs to have complete control. And without that control, it's all chaos, and the people that are disrupting his plan need to die. That's the flaw. So think about what type of things your villains are going to have in mind and have a little bit twisted, or maybe a lot twisted, that puts them in the realm of someone who has so much more to gain by going that extra step. So knowing how your villains solve problems is also something that occasionally gets overlooked, because not every villain approaches conflict the same way, and not every villain brings conflict the same way. So let's look at a couple of different examples. For one, the Joker. He's way outside the box, has a lot of different types of things that he goes after and just either completely decimates in really unpredictable ways, but he usually goes for mass chaos and confusion. So that's his strategy. Let's look at Cersei Lannister from Game of Thrones. She's a lot more political, plotting, conniving, getting other people to do her dirty work and not necessarily getting her hands dirty at any point in the game. Then let's look at someone like Killmonger from Black Panther. Eric Killmonger, someone who has a master assassin level of credentials, somebody who has a very sympathetic reason to want to intervene in Wakanda, and at the same time has that same level of flaw to want to bring chaos and destruction to the entire world. And you might agree with him, you might not, but at the same time, you have all of those different things that lead into how he solves problems, which is a little bit more conniving, but it's sort of between the Joker and Cersei, right? He's able to plan and plot and come up with all of these different ways to get in where he needs to get, but at the same time, he still gets his hands dirty. All of these villains approach things in very different ways, and understanding how your particular villain will approach things, maybe it's reliant upon their exceptionalism. Maybe what makes them exceptional is how they solve problems. And at the same time, trying to think about how these different characters like Cersei and Killmonger and the Joker all approach their problem solvings are really what give them the flavor of their particular villain and are what make them so interesting to come back to again and again as these really great foils for the heroes of the story. So one of the best things that you need to know about your villain right away is their goal. We've talked about a couple of them already. Now, Thanos wants to bring balance to the universe. Palpatine wants to bring peace to the entire galaxy. The Joker just wants to watch the world burn. But think about that for a minute. We as the party and as the audience don't know what the Joker wants, but the Joker does. And even though he doesn't reveal it to a bunch of different people, maybe even in the movies or in a lot of the comic books that he's in, the Joker has a goal. And even though we don't know what it is, it's important that you as the storyteller know what your villain's goal actually is. And that's really, really vital to creating tension with the villain and the party. Because if you don't take the time to actually build upon the idea of what your villain wants, then again, you may just be going back to the idea of a villain being evil for evil's sake. So you have to understand what your villain is trying to achieve by all of their actions. And again, if you can come up with a way to have the villain know what their goal is, but maybe keep it obfuscated from the rest of the players, that leads to a lot more stakes, because if your players are trying to figure out what the villain's actually trying to do, again, it raises tension, it raises stakes. If you're dropping little subtle hints about the villain's ultimate goal, again, your players can try to pick those up. They might misinterpret some, they might miss some. That gives you, the storyteller, the opportunity to know exactly what your players think of what your villain really wants. One way that I've found that helps all the time is just to consider what makes that villain want to do what their goal is. Because oftentimes that background motivation and that idea of them being wronged or having a desire to accomplish something that can benefit them and maybe even other people is actually what starts them down the path of villainy in the first place. So understanding your villain's goal is really essential. It's just as essential as what makes them flawed, exceptional, sympathetic, and how they problem solve. Your villain's goal is the basis of what makes them a villain. This last tip is probably the most important thing that I can give to anybody that does a tabletop role-playing game about a villain. This was given to me a number of years ago by a friend of mine, and it completely changed how I approach dealing with villains inside of my games. Know what your villain is doing at all times. The reason this is so important is because it doesn't matter what system you're playing on. If you have a villain that has a goal, then you know exactly what your villain's going to try to accomplish each time you have a play session. So if your players decide that they know that there's an evil wizard who's trying to overthrow a king and destroy a kingdom, and they've been working towards that plot, that's fine. But say 3 sessions in, they're like, okay, that villain's pretty interesting, but guys, let's go be pirates. You as a storyteller have not necessarily an obligation, but at least an understanding of what your players want. And if you want to have your players do what they want to do inside of a big open world game, then if it were me, I'd let them go be pirates. But in the meantime, that evil wizard we were just talking about, he's going to keep on doing what he's doing. He's going to keep on sneaking into the city and causing chaos, maybe raising up some zombies, maybe killing the king, maybe killing some townspeople, maybe taking over the city and building up an army of his own. So at a certain point, what ends up happening is that villain gets their goal and moves on to the next goal, and your party is out there in this ocean having a good time. And then maybe a couple of sessions go by and they're like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe we do need to go back to shore to resupply, but, let's go deal with that wizard guy while we were, back in town. But then when they get back into town, what happens? Armies of undead, the king is dead, townspeople are scattered, the entire city is destroyed. Now they have to deal with that or leave. But at the same time, you knew what your villain was trying to do, and as long as the party wasn't there to actually get in the way, the villain could keep going, and they could keep achieving goals. That idea of knowing what your villain is trying to accomplish in each individual session is so important to be able to keep the plot moving for your villain, even if your players decide to go another direction. Because that gives your players the opportunity to maybe even accidentally happen upon the different things that your villain is trying to accomplish. So maybe your evil wizard guy is trying to overtake the city, but he has to flood the sewers of the city with zombies. Maybe your entire party decides that we should investigate some of these stories we've heard about local children going missing around sewers at night. So when they do, they happen upon these zombies that are this massive infestation. Oh my gosh, where did the zombies come from? Then they start investigating, trying to figure some things out, and then they determine that the zombies came from the evil wizard somewhere outside the town. That type of accidental reveal or plot motion gives you the opportunity to keep your villain's plan cooking and bring your party in whenever they feel like they understand something that might be just enough to get them motivated to start investigating the bigger evil plot that you have inside for your villain to want to keep moving along in the story. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is sort of a bonus tip, and I know it's sort of weird, but it'll be short. If you've put a lot of time and energy and effort into creating a villain, chances are you're going to get attached to them. And that's fine, it's natural. Villains are a lot of fun to create and they're a lot of fun to play. But at a certain point, if your players do their jobs as heroes and try to overcome the villain that you've created, they're eventually going to be successful. And at that point, you're going to have to give it up and let the villain die. I've seen it happen a couple of times where storytellers get very attached to their villain and they don't really want the players to be able to seal the deal and save the town, save the village, save the world. That's when you need to step back and understand what you're involved with. Again, any type of tabletop role-playing game is a collaborative storytelling process. You want to tell the story that you've created as a storyteller, but your players are also an integral part of that game and an integral part of that story. So whenever your heroes inevitably defeat the villain and save the day, your responsibility as a storyteller, in my opinion, is to take it with grace, understand that as the villain of the story, the inevitable thing that was going to happen is that your villain was going to lose. And that's okay, because as long as everybody's having a good time, that's what matters no matter what system you're playing. All right. Thanks so much for coming in today, guys. We appreciate you being here, listening to me talk about villains and all the different stuff that I learned over the years to try to make compelling villains that are good for story. Now, if you learned anything today, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. We appreciate you coming and watching. We want to grow the channel. Follow us on Instagram. And if you have any questions about what you heard today, or if you have any ideas about what you heard today, leave them in the comments below or on Instagram. We love to hear from you. And I really want to encourage you guys that if you have any questions about this or anything else in any system that you've played, let us know. I'm happy to answer questions. But until next time, thanks so much for coming and always have a good time adventuring.